Welcome to the MSD Animal Health Podcast. This is the third episode of our Total Calf Health Solutions podcast series. My name is Emma Gilsenan and I'm Ruminant Product Manager with MSD Animal Health. And I'm here today with Eamon O'Connell, a vet in Summerhill Veterinary Practice here in Nenagh, County Tipperary. Eamon, would you like to introduce yourself?
Eamon O'Connell is my name. As you said, I'm a partner in Summerhill Vets in Nenagh, County Tip. We're a 9-vet mixed practice. Predominantly dairy work, but a lot of calf rearing and contract rearing involved as well.
Perfect. And our podcast today is on coccidiosis. So Eamon, how common is coccidiosis when you're out and about? How often are you seeing it come up?
It's a lot more common than people realise, Emma, I think. We see an awful lot of scour outbreaks in both younger calves and in older calves out of grass. And without diagnostics, we're sort of putting it down to incidental things. But when we get into diagnostics and we drill down into it, we find coccidiosis is at play quite a bit more than a lot of people think.
Coccidiosis is a parasite, as we know. How does it occur, or what is the cycle there of coccidiosis?
Well, it sits in the environment, Emma. The one thing about coccidiosis is just how persistent that it is. It can survive, in particular, from one year to another in the right conditions. So somewhere wet, somewhere dirty, bit of moisture, some heat, it'll survive and it'll sit there nice and cosy until the next year when there's calves in that environment and suddenly it starts to arrive into the system again. You've got a cycle then that where we really don't see any clinical signs in calves up to kind of 3 weeks of age, but they're already getting infected at a younger age. So realistically, this time of year, it's sitting there ready to take hold in an awful lot of farms that we don't really know that's there already.
Yeah, and in terms of the symptoms then, like obviously if it's sitting there in the environment and animals are becoming exposed to it, what are kind of the common symptoms you'd see of coccidiosis?
Well, the common one that we're all really familiar with is the calf with what we'd say is blood scour. So he's dirty and bloody behind, like starting to lose weight, quite sick. They'll force and they'll raise their tail head a good bit because they're really uncomfortable. They're the real obvious ones. But the thing about coccidiosis is the obvious coccidiosis calf is very easy to see, very easy to recognise. It's the subclinical ones that we are most concerned with, where they have a reduced daily live weight gain. They can just slowly but surely start to lose condition. They might be a little bit scour, but not too bad. Those are the ones we'd be most concerned about. As I said, the obvious blood scour, as we would call it, is really easy to see. It's the subclinical, under the radar calves that we'd be most concerned about.
And you mentioned there that you've seen it as well in older animals. Yeah. When does it typically occur? Like what age? Even for sheep as well. I know coccidiosis is common in sheep as well. When would you typically see it in calves or lambs?
Well, we kind of have two separate groups. In calves and lambs, we'd often see it kind of 3 to 4 weeks of age, often associated with a stressor, either bad weather or something like dehorning. And the second time we'll see it then is when those animals go to grass. Kind of 2 to 3 weeks after turnout, you'll often see coccidiosis out there, and it can start getting confused with other diseases when it's out of grass. So it's important to kind of keep an eye, get the diagnostics done and figure out that it just might be coccidiosis that's causing problems.
I suppose if a farmer was concerned that they might have coccidiosis in their housing or after turnout, what would your advice be there for that farmer?
The fecal samples are vitally important. Like you cannot stress enough just how important fecal sampling is. Regular fecal sampling and correct timing of fecal sampling, and correct method of fecal sampling, I suppose too. And you could go down a rabbit hole with that, but realistically, the fecal samples are the most important. If you think there's an issue, either you think it's coccidiosis or you might think it's something else. If your calves are scoured or they're losing body weight or they're not thriving as well as they are, some fecal samples will point you in the right direction very, very quickly.
And in terms of the impact then, Eamon, of a coccidiosis outbreak, like you mentioned, blood in the scour there, so that's obviously an indication of some sort of intestinal damage. In terms of the impacts then, the long-term or the short-term impacts, what impact can coccidiosis have?
Well, it has a massive impact, Emma, because it affects the lining of their intestine and their ability to absorb nutrients, to absorb minerals, to get maximum benefit from their feed. So if you think a calf gets coccidiosis, you get him over it and he's recovering, he still doesn't have the same ability to absorb everything he needs to absorb from his feed that a normal healthy calf would. So all of a sudden you've got a calf that's 3-4 weeks old that's recovered, but there's a concern now that will it make its target weight in a year's time for bulling if it's a Frisian heifer, or will it make target weights as regards getting fit for the factory in a year and a half's time? It's a huge concern.
Yeah, and maybe farmers that are seeing that reduced average daily gain and they don't really know why, there could be subclinical coccidiosis there, would you say?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, a lot of farmers would be, you'd look at a group of calves, let's say, and you'll say, right, okay, there's a good few of these are thriving fine, there's a couple of stragglers, and you just put it down to, they're just a couple of stragglers. But a lot of the time, if you get in there, get a fecal sample off some of those stragglers, you'll find out there could be some subclinical coccidiosis at play. And treating them could be the difference between them making target weights and staying in the herd or making you money versus not.
Yeah, and then reaching obviously target weights, finishing weights, pre-breeding, heifers reaching their target pre-breeding weight, it all has an impact on that as well. Coccidiosis.
It's a very narrow window when you think about it. I mean, we're asking heifers that are born today to reach target weight in pretty much 14, 15 months' time. There's no real room for setback, and we're asking them to calve down in 24 months from today, pretty much. So your Frisian heifer calves that you're looking at in the pen today that are a week old, you're asking them to calve down into your herd in 24 months' time. There's little or no margin for error. So coccidiosis is the error that will be the difference between them staying in the herd and not.
Yeah, absolutely. Just to go back to the cycle there again, Eamon, you mentioned it's really infectious. Like, why is coccidiosis so infectious?
Well, I suppose the first thing is its ability to survive. That's the big thing, is that it'll stay in the environment, as we said earlier, and it'll sit there for well over a year waiting to infect again. The other thing that happens is when a calf gets infected with coccidiosis and starts to have scour or diarrhea, it shed in huge quantities into the environment. So then you're suddenly starting to look at indoors where there's any dirt, there's a potential for infection. So your calf feeders, your straw, your bedding, your cleanliness and hygiene is vital when it comes to coccidiosis. The more dirt there is, the more likely you are to help the infection to spread and for more calves to get infected. And similarly then when you go outdoors, out into the field, you've got to think about the places where coccidiosis will survive and where calves can pick it up. So around water troughs would be the big one, and around meal troughs as well in the field. I mean, it's okay at the moment, but let's say the weather gets wet, you've got ground getting mucked up, you want to keep your meal troughs moved around just so that the wetness underfoot doesn't become a harbour for coccidiosis. And similarly the water troughs, I mean, every second one we see has a little bit of a leak and there's a puddle of water around it. Like, if you can get that dry and you can get it raised up so that the calves aren't standing in muck where there's going to be coccidiosis waiting to infect them when they go back out into a dry place again.
Like you mentioned there, Eamon, like it's everywhere. So animals are susceptible indoors, they can be susceptible outdoors. And there's a difference in the species as well, isn't there? In the Emeria species, they're not the same. They can be loads of different types.
Yep. Oh, they can, yeah. Yeah. And I mean, you've got to be conscious when we talk about it being everywhere, just about how, sorry, I'm making a mess of that now.
You Grant.
What's the word I'm looking for? Yeah, transmissible. Sorry, I'll start again then.
Yes, start that piece again, yeah.
I suppose you have to be conscious when we talk about how infectious it is, just how transmissible it is. When you say it's everywhere, I mean, you have quite a high possibility of bringing this on your pull-ups, on your wellies, somebody coming in to visit the farm. And the fact that it survives so well, and the fact that it's so transmissible, I mean, you have to look at every avenue that it can gain entrance to your herd to try and stop it from getting in there.
So we talked lots there, Eamon, around the disease, how infectious it is, how prevalent it is. In terms of controlling coccidiosis, there's obviously no one size fits all. What would your advice there be to farmers who have maybe historic issues with coccidiosis on their farm?
I mean, as you said, Emma, no one size fits all. So every farm is different, even though we think all farms are very similar. Every farm is different. You have to go down to start at the very, very basics to say, right, how am I going to get this under control? If you have historic problems on your farm with coccidiosis, we need to sit down before things get hectic, and I know they're already hectic, but we really need to have a look at it now and say, okay, where has this come from? Is there particular points, pressure points on farm that we can recognise as where coccidiosis is gaining a foothold and starting to infect? So be that, is there a pressure point as regards our young calves coming from single pens to group pens? Is there a pressure point when they get turned out of grass onto paddocks where there was previously coccidiosis before? I mean, if we can identify these pressure points and either avoid them or come up with a plan to lessen the issues with them, we can make a good stab at least getting coccidiosis under some sort of control.
Yeah, and I suppose MSD has a product there, Gilsenan. It's its active ingredient is diclasural, and it's seen as a preventative rather than a treatment against coccidiosis as well. What would your advice be there for farmers who want to use this product to prevent coccidiosis, maybe where they have that historic incidences of coccidiosis on their farm?
Yeah, I think it's very important to recognise the benefits of Ecoxen when it comes to preventative. So, I mean, there's lots and lots of products on the market, and I mean, you can talk to your vet and all your vets will give you pretty similar advice when it comes to prevention as regards using Ecoxen. You can kind of look at sort of trying to break the life cycles where we really would use it. So we look at around the 3 weeks of age in a lot of farms as a pressure point. You're coming to stress points where the cow's immunity is worn off, the calf is trying to make its own, and it's under pressure for lots of different reasons. It could be housing, could be dehorning. We try and get in there around those pressure points at 3.5 weeks, especially if there's a historic issue with coccidiosis coming to the head at that stage and getting in there with a treatment. Similarly, again, then when they go out to pasture, we kind of look at 2.5 weeks after turnout, and a lot of farms seems to be an issue. So again, we're trying to break the life cycle. We're not trying to just clean the whole thing out. We're aiming at getting a little bit of immunity to build up, then getting your Ecoxen in, so the calf has his own immunity, and the product just helps then to kill off what the calf isn't able to deal with.
Yeah, so it's a balancing act really between the exposure to the parasite and allowing the calf to develop their own natural immunity. Yeah,
there's a lot of conversations recently around parasite control, especially worming and the correct use of wormers and stuff. And we're all starting to realise now that a certain level of own made immunity is very, very important, because we've seen issues with wormers that have been overused where animals don't have their own immunity built up, and that leads to problems down the line. Ecoxen is trying to do something similar, where it's letting them have their own little bit of immunity built up, their own system is making, and there's nothing better than your own immunity if you can manage it. So as you say, it's a balancing act, but definitely some of your own made immunity is quite important.
Yeah, and there's even research to show there that animals that have been treated with a diclasural based product over time have greater average daily gain, because it is allowing them to build up their own natural immunity rather than going in and just wiping everything out and completely cleaning it out, so they just don't have the chance to develop that natural immunity.
Yeah. What we find quite useful for the product is the fact that you're not limited. I mean, it's any age, any weight, indoors or outdoors. It does make a difference. We've had instances in the past where, and look, there's lots of products out there that are marketed as treating coccidiosis. But I think from the point of view of, again, as we said, your own immunity and the balancing act between it, and the fact that you can use it indoors, outdoors, over 80 kilos, under 80 kilos, it's irrelevant with Ecoxen, and that makes it a very, very useful product because it gives you a bit of flexibility that others don't.
Exactly, yeah, that flexibility there is what farmers need. And in terms of just, you mentioned their stressful periods of times for the animals, like let's say around dehorning and weaning, where farmers maybe don't have historic issues with coccidiosis, but that stressful time is affecting their immunity, which could open the doors, I suppose, for a coccidiosis outbreak. What would your advice be there for those farmers?
Well, in a lot of farms we have that are spring-based calving, at this time of year, in February, we don't have a lot of problems. There's no major stress in the system. Things is just starting to build up. It's usually, a lot of lads will say, oh, from Paddy's Day onwards, you can start getting worried about stress or worried about sickness. But the main reason for that is the stress levels build up to then. So there's more and more calves in the house, so your facilities are under pressure, your temperatures are increasing, your probably cows next door are under pressure too. And then you introduce something like dehorning into the mix. It's the perfect storm for the likes of coccidiosis to just take hold. So we would advise people that when they're going about dehorning, ideally get your Ecoxen treatment in so that you have the immunity there and you have the treatment in before the stressor arrives. So at least then you're doing as best you can not to let the stress overload the system for coccidiosis to take hold.
So maybe on farms this time of year, farmers, particularly calf to beef, would be buying a lot of calves in. What would your advice be for them there in terms of coccidiosis control?
Well, I know this year in particular, talking to a lot of our calf to beef guys, the calves they're buying in tend to be that little bit older. Before you were buying in calves at 10 days old, 14 days old, so you were buying in a real baby calf. Now you're starting to see guys buying in calves 3 weeks old, 4 weeks old. You have to just make the presumption that the combination of stress and their age means they're arriving on farm with coccidiosis in their system. You can't afford not to make that presumption, because even if you're buying them from farm to farm, the stress of movement alone. I know we've seen last year in particular, one guy bought calves from a farm, transported them on a wet, windy day. The calves were stressed. That's enough of stress for a little calf. So you can do, look, as we said earlier on, every farm is different. Some people will treat them on arrival. Some people will give them a day or two in quarantine to settle down and then treat them. Either once they're separate from the other calves until they are treated and have gotten over the first couple of days of arriving on farm. From a complete disease prevention point of view, from a pneumonia, all that, but in particular when we're talking about coccidiosis, I think you've got to presume that any calf that arrives on farm that's 3 weeks or 3 weeks plus is going to have the potential to pick up coccidiosis. So as far as I'm concerned, it's a no-brainer to treat these calves rather than see what happens.
Yeah. It's just that bit of security there that those calves are immediately protected. Just to go back again, Eamon, on one point you mentioned around the subclinical cases of coccidiosis, those that you don't see. So I suppose in those situations it is so important to treat the whole group as well, not just the animals that you might see those clinical signs.
Oh, 100%. I think if you go to a group of calves and you start trying to treat individuals with clinical signs, I think you end up getting dizzy. You're just chasing calves around. You've got one guy marked today, another one picks it up tomorrow, and you run the risk of eventually everything in the pen having clinical coccidiosis if you just don't get in and wipe it. So you can get in at the start. If you have one or two calves with clinical signs, you really have to treat the whole group. It will be completely beneficial in the long run. It's a stopgap, and it also stops you trying to find which one was sick and which one did I treat, and I wonder is he better or not. At least if the whole group is treated, well, you've got a day and a date in the calendar that you go, I treated all these, and you can follow on from there.
Yeah, absolutely. So Eamon, we've gone through so much there in the last 15 to 20 minutes. If you could maybe summarise it in 3 points for our listeners, what would those be?
So the most important take-home message, number 1, would be the use of diagnostics. We see a lot of people make the mistake of presuming that a scour outbreak is something that it's not. So outdoors, you just presume it's either worms, or you presume it's summer scour syndrome. Indoors, you kind of go, oh, I wonder, is it just nutritional? Take some fecal samples, get them analysed. Your vet will turn them over very, very quickly. And at least if you have an answer, and let's just say it's coccidiosis, you can formulate a plan to sort that out rather than shooting in the dark. The second take-home message then would be using the correct time of treatment. Again, when you look at calves indoors, you're talking about just over 3 weeks old, trying to think about when a period of stress is going to arrive and try and time your treatment around that. And similarly, outdoors, to time your treatment 2.5 weeks after turnout. I know historically we've come across a lot of farmers that have given Vicoxin at turnout because it's handy, and then realise they've got an outbreak of coccidiosis scour 2-3 weeks post turnout. Realistically, the dose at turnout just isn't at the correct time, so it can't be expected to do what you want it to do. So correct timing is vitally important. So you're talking about 3 weeks plus at a stressor indoors, and 2.5 weeks post turnout outdoors then. And then I suppose the last point, and it's a very important one, is with regard to timing of treatment as well, on farms that have had historical issues with coccidiosis. So let's just say last year or the year before, you saw it at dehorning, you saw it at a particular time of year or a particular shed. I think it's useful to have a note of that and try and prevent it this year, aiming at a similar time. So again, last year if you had it at dehorning, don't wait this year. Like, it's more than likely going to happen again. Let's go in at the same time and get our treatment right at the right time. And then I suppose the last take-home point as regards prevention of coccidiosis would be to emphasise just how important the multifactorial element of it is. It's not just down to using a product. There's so much more around it that has to be done from a management point of view. As we said earlier on, hygiene is vital around your calf pens in particular, and especially around your feeding equipment, your buckets, your calf feeders. I mean, at least once a day cleaning and proper cleaning. We were chatting earlier and we just said you wouldn't eat your cornflakes out of the same bowl without washing it for a week. I think it has to be washed every day at a minimum. Similarly, recognising the pressure points and trying to avoid those from a management point of view. Like if you're getting coccidiosis when you're bringing calves from single pens across to group pens, trying to manage that in a way where there's not overcrowding, the beds are nice and dry, there's good dry straw in there, there's lots of space, the calves don't get stressed out. Even down to the fact that you're coming from somewhere else and you're coming back with your pull-ups and your wellies, to have dip and disinfectant at the gate so that you're not bringing it from somewhere into your own farm. There's just so many other elements other than the use of a dose to prevent coccidiosis from gaining a foothold in your farm.
Thanks very much, Eamon. We'll leave it at that. Thanks so much for joining us, and best of luck with the rest of the spring.
But yeah, hopefully it's nice and quiet. Yeah.